If there are any technical difficulties, let me know, and I'm CT and experiencing very unstable internet this morning, so apologies if I pop in and out. For those of you who have been at our coffee hours previously, for this first part, if you all can turn on your cameras, that'd be great, so that we could have a space of face-to-face connection and collaboration, and it would be great to see each other. I know that there are faces both new and old. We're so glad that you're here. Just as a reminder to folks, we've had these coffee hours on the third Friday of the month, approximately, with some variation, at 10 every month. And we have 2 more scheduled left this year. This is a space for all of us to share on our sustainability work through different lenses, successes, challenges, opportunities. And it's a space for mutual support. And above all, it's a space for collaboration across town boundaries and to inspire and support each other. The team have been running these coffee hours, so hopefully you've seen very many different faces. It's nice to see all of you. So our format is we'll start with this brief sharing that's sustainable CT grounded, and then we'll move to our more formal presentation. We have some phenomenal guests as well as sustainable CT support.
Oh, shit. Oh, crap.
I think Alyssa's internet is fairly spotty, so if she doesn't come back, I think Camille and I are next on the agenda. Maybe she can find better internet.
Can I just point out something I'm witnessing is the chat doesn't seem to be working for me. When I click on it, the screen changes size. And then when I click it on it again, it goes back to the original size. So for some reason, the chat box is changing my...
Apologize, the internet kicked me off. So again, thanks for bearing with the technological challenge. What's the last thing you all heard? This is your test now to see who's paying attention.
Just a general welcome and explanation of people being on screen, and then we'll go into the formal part of the meeting.
Thank you all for your patience. Can you see and hear me? You can like wave as I come in and out of internet land. Do you see me? Do you hear me? Yes, no, maybe so.
Yes.
Anybody? I need some kind of thumbs up or sign to know that I'm
connected. I can't, I'm not seeing you.
Yes. All right, well, given my challenges, I don't want to hold us up any further. I'm going to turn things over to Mark Abraham and Camille Seaberry of DataHaven, who have a wonderful presentation prepared for us today. So Mark and Camille, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Alyssa. Yeah, I was just saying, if you'd like to find better internet, we'll take about 20 minutes, I guess, and you can come back on and do your portion of the agenda, perhaps after us. But just a thought. I'll start sharing screen and we'll go from there. Hi, everyone. I'm Mark Abraham. I'm the Executive Director at DataHaven, and I'm joined by Camille Seaberry today, who's the Senior Research Associate at DataHaven. Just feel free to speak up if you have trouble hearing or seeing the slides. And I'll take a look at the chat as well. We're going to do a brief overview of slides. We're going to try to be as brief as possible so that we can leave more time for questions that you may have about the reports. I know some of you may have read these reports already or seen them since Sustainable Connecticut sent them out in their emails. So just to overview, the reports provide information for all 169 towns in the state. And for these, I'll talk a little bit about why we developed them in a minute, but basically we're using some new approaches to analyze data. So basically producing information about Connecticut for local areas like towns that previously generally wasn't available or wasn't easily available from any kind of websites or other sources. The reason we did that was to get more granular data about towns, about groups within the towns. And in some cases, some of the federal and state data in the reports too was only released for the first time, like within the past year or so. So you'll see some of that in the reports too. And the reports, you know, the new data sources gave us the impetus for that. So we used the 2020 census for demographics, the American Community Survey, state agency data, and some other administrative sources like the State Department of Education, for example. And then you'll see data from the 2015 to 2018 DataHaven Community Wellbeing Survey. That data is based on more than 32,000 live interviews with randomly selected adults. We weight the data by like age and race and gender. So it's very representative of the populations in each town. And you'll often see that data for your town or region as well in the report. The DataHaven survey covers like a wide variety of topics, including the built environment, like sidewalks, health issues, economic issues, and others. And we are now planning to add more data once the more 2020 census data is out. We were actually doing the DataHaven survey again in 2021. So once those projects are completed, we can add that data in version 2.0, which we plan to release next year. We're also looking at new indicators to add and other ways to present the data in the report. So today we're hoping to get some feedback from you as users of the report to help us improve the reports when we release version 2.0. The audiences for the reports, we're thinking residents, they're obviously very interested in their town in particular, voters in the town. In the past year, especially since mid-2020, we've seen many new towns form committees on inclusion or anti-racism or declaring racism a public health crisis. And that is a response to a number of things happening in society, including the disparities related to the COVID pandemic. There are also many town committees on equity and sustainability, that, including the ones Sustainable Connecticut works with. So basically those committees, as soon as they were formed, they started sending us emails requesting like data for their town broken down for different groups. And that data is just generally, previous to the reports, it generally just like wasn't available anywhere. Like you can get data for your town compared to the state, say, but to get data for different groups within your town, in many cases that data was not available anywhere. So we really saw a need for this product as a result of all these questions we were receiving from different groups around the state. We've already seen many town elected officials like mayors and first selectmen use the reports, and also candidates running for office. Obviously nonprofits who serve like specific communities are using them. And they're being used in schools and teaching and like college level teaching or school level teaching. So it's good when the students can engage with data about the community where they live. So we see many teachers using the reports. Also, state legislators would be interested. We have a separate product called the Legislative District Profiles on our website. That's data for like specific House or Senate districts that complements this resource, but we see a use in state policymaking as well. And just in the reports have only been out for about a month now. We've already seen 3,000 people obtain them from the website, which is very high for sort of a PDF type report. So all over the state. Some examples of how residents are using them, and we encourage you to also use the data in this way, is like contacting reporters to get articles written about your town. So in the New Haven Register, for example, there have been a number of reports about different towns, and also op-eds like this one just this morning in the Stamford Advocate was published. It talks about, you know, how to make Stamford, Connecticut a better town, basically. I don't know if Emily, she may be involved in Sustainable Connecticut, just given her work in the homelessness area, but she wrote a nice op-ed today. Some of the limitations in the report, I think, are important to acknowledge. Obviously, you'll get questions about these sorts of issues as you use the report. Many of the charts in the report, they don't show every single group, like Pacific Islander, for example. It just depends on the sample sizes in the town. So the census, you know, it does surveys, but to measure something like income in a small group, you do need you need to interview a certain number of families. So for those data, we often, in the report, we include statewide data as a benchmark. So you'll often see data about the state of Connecticut for a small group. Then as you get to your town, you might just see data for like Black, Latino, white adults. Disparities can be disguised by data aggregation. For example, like within Asian Americans, you have residents with ancestry or immigration, you know, migration history from many different countries throughout Asia. So something like data for Filipinos, it could look very different from data for other Asian groups. So we know that the averages do mask that, similar with like the data for white adults, Albanian adults in Connecticut, they may have a different income level than white adults in general. So the census and DataHaven survey data, they often allow more granular analysis, but we don't necessarily present that in the report in this version of the report. There are other reports we've published that discuss some of those issues. We also did a YouTube video, why Asian American data is not enough. If you look at the DataHaven YouTube page, that sort of goes into that issue with some interviews. Another limitation, we have some data, mostly at the state level, about Native American race. That's how people identify on the census as like Asian or Native American or some combination. In this case, it's referring to the race or how people identify as Native American race. It's not the same as tribal affiliation though. So obviously that is important. If you're Native American, you don't necessarily use the race data as much as like your data or information about your tribal affiliation. And then the town equity reports are designed to be like, you know, sort of printable 30-page, 40-page document and easy to access. A lot of the context around the data, though we do have some discussion in the town equity reports, a lot of the deeper context, like for example, details about redlining in communities, you should refer to our other reports, like we released a health equity report last year. We have the community wellbeing index for different areas, and those get into like a lot more detailed discussion about any of the data points in the report. And I'd also just like to thank the report authors. Camille Seaberry is going to speak next about the data, Kelly Davila, and myself, and then obviously the funders, Tremaine Foundation, Community Foundation, and the Cancer Center were the main funders of this specific project. Sustainable Connecticut helped us sort of imagine what this product could do, and we received a lot of suggestions from Alyssa and the team at Sustainable Connecticut, and the equity coaches as well. And then the funders of some of the key data sources in the report are available because of support from many of the 80 or so public and private partners around the state. I'll turn it over to Camille.
Hi, everybody. So I'm just going to talk pretty briefly about some of the indicators that we included, some of kind of our approach to this project. I'm using Hamden as an example, but we did these for every town in Connecticut. So there's 169 different versions of this. And for each one, we compared, anytime that it was possible, we looked at town level data. And so every town has, at least the majority of the indicators are included for every town. Some of the really small towns there might be some things that we weren't able to do, or we weren't able to do breakdowns. We could do like an overall number, which, as Mark mentioned, you do end up with patterns getting masked by having just an average, even within groups. But, you know, to the best of our ability, we did, and, you know, based on data limitations, we did try to have as many breakdowns as we could. So one of the big questions that we always ask, and that kind of most of the things that we look at go back to, is just where do people live? So what neighborhoods people are in, what's available to them in those neighborhoods. So, you know, that might be the type of housing that's available, whether there's housing that you can buy, like even a housing, you know, what the housing stock is in your area, access to schools, municipal spending, healthcare resources, transportation, environmental hazards. So all of those sorts of things really depend on where you live. And a lot of the things that we look at, whether it's like health outcomes or health risk factors or employment, education, all sorts of things that people ask us about, our answer tends to be, well, you need to look at segregation and income inequality and access to resources, because those tend to be kind of the backbone of all of these other things that we see around Connecticut. So one of the things we looked at is just, where do people live? How is that changing? So we were able to compare 2010 data from the 10-year census to the new data that just is kind of coming out in bits right now from the 2020 census, and see the ways that both the state is diversifying and a lot of towns, like within each town, populations are diversifying. And I'll also just mention real quick, because this is kind of a weird technical point, we used, for a lot of things, we used PUMAs, which are public use microdata areas. And that's kind of a technical thing, but it's a small group of towns used for some data aggregations. And so we chose to do that instead of larger regions or counties, just so we could get a little bit more local without compromising the quality of data that we had available. So Mark, if you want to go to the next one. So like Mark and I have both mentioned, you can look at averages for things. You can look at, you know, something like homeownership, for example. But to really be talking about equity, you need to start taking those numbers and breaking them apart, complicating them, figuring out what are kind of the patterns within the patterns that make up an average number. So one of the things we looked at was homeownership rates, and realizing that, you know, kind of across the board, younger adults have lower homeownership. Folks that are, you know, maybe just out of college, just out of high school, kind of getting more financially established. But we also see disparities within age groups by race, such that in, not quite in the Hampden area, but in a lot of areas, you end up with younger white adults having higher homeownership rates than older Black and Latino adults. So that's kind of, you know, kind of looking at like the resources that people have access to, and things that they have control over, whether it's like their environment, quality of their living conditions, financial stability that you get from home ownership, and just thinking about the implications of, you know, younger white adults having kind of a head start over over other adults. Also thinking about the sorts of stability that you might need as you age, and seeing that Black and Latino adults in a lot of places in Connecticut still don't have that, still have lower homeownership, and are kind of might be lacking that stability in getting into their senior years. Mark, if you want to go to the next one. So another example, you know, Connecticut has a relatively high median income. And so that's something that people know about Connecticut as it compares to the US. But within that, if you break it down, you end up seeing these really large disparities. And so a lot of times when people talk about a wage gap, they're talking about just men versus women in terms of wages. But we wanted to take that and kind of control for a couple things. So like age, full-time work status. And if you break that down more than just by gender, if you break that down also by race, you start seeing more patterns. So that you end up seeing things that might be counterintuitive, that you would normally, you're accustomed to thinking of the wage gap as being just men's pay versus women's pay. When you break that down by both gender and race, you start to see that in a lot of areas throughout the state, white women actually have higher pay by a pretty significant margin than Black and Latino men. So it's not quite as simple as just men's pay versus women's pay, because you actually have then a wage gap between white women and other women, but also other men of color, or sorry, at least Black and Latino men. So that's one of the sorts of things that you might not notice from just looking at averages or just the way that we commonly talk about those. But you get that on a local level. So we were able to break that down to those PUMA areas and see those same sorts of patterns playing out even just within a region of just a few towns, or even within a single town. So Mark, if you want to go to the next one. So one of the things that we looked at, again, getting back to location, just life expectancy, which in a lot of ways is kind of the ultimate indicator of kind of quality of life and quality of health. And that's one of those that can jump by several years just by crossing over a town boundary or even just a neighborhood boundary. So within New Haven, I know we've looked at just crossing Chapel Street from Worcester Square into Fairhaven. You see a sizable jump in life expectancy by a couple of years. So that's one of the things to sort of think about. All of these other indicators, how do those kind of culminate then in life expectancy? And so how do those factors that are kind of location-based or resource-based then kind of all make up this one indicator where we see these pretty clear spatial patterns. It's also good to, or it's also kind of a practice that we can get into more to be actually defining what you're measuring around a goal of equity, or around just a kind of task of analyzing what equity can be in our towns, what that looks like. So as an example, one of the things that we included, so we actually only included the map that's on the right, but I wanted to use the one on the left as an example as well. So the EPA has this environmental justice index that they do by block groups, which are pretty small. They're generally just a few blocks within a town. And so they took a number of environmental hazards. So one example that we talk about a lot is the risk of exposure to lead paint. But they also included proximity to highways, proximity to water treatment facilities. And so they did this in two forms. So on one, they just took those risk factors and they did a percentile nationally. So kind of putting you in a relatively low risk, high risk sort of scale. But then they took that and they adjusted it for kind of what they were defining as vulnerable populations. And they did a couple versions of that. We just worked with the simpler one, which was just taking that and then scaling it based on the population in an area that was people of color, and the low income population, and kind of seeing those as groups that would be more vulnerable to whatever those risk factors are. And then kind of reassessing the risk. So then you start to see these maps shift a little bit, where an area might have, risk of one of these hazards, so lead paint, for example, but they also might have the resources to help abate those issues or help deal with those issues or clean them up or, whatever it may be. So they kind of changed what they were measuring or how they were defining it around this goal of recognizing those vulnerabilities that certain communities might have. So then those are just a couple kind of tidbits, but our full reports are online. I put up a short link if that's easier, but they're also just, if you go to ctdatahaven.org, every town is available online. So I think if we want to take, I'm not sure how much time we have, maybe Alyssa can say, but if we want to do questions from there.
Alyssa, unfortunately, is having some technical difficulties. So if you want to take some questions right now, we'll then move into introducing Ashley and Emily, or Elizabeth.
Thank you. Yeah, you can unmute, or I guess add them to the chat. We can see them in the chat as well.
Or comments, or anything that you think we are missing is fine to hear as well.
I can make a comment. Am I here? There you go. You hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, okay. I'm from Rocky Hill, and I was just looking through the equity toolkit, and, like the first step was, check out all these reports. And so, wow, what great timing. And thank you very much for a great explanation of them. I can't wait to actually get back and complicate them myself. So thank you.
Great. There's a question in the chat about report for a specific set of towns. That's something that we could work out. Maybe if something like that, people want to email Mark, I'll volunteer Mark to field something like that.
Yeah. So yeah, we produce them for different specific sets of towns. Like, every agency in Connecticut has its own sort of agency service area. So we've been producing them for like any other group of towns people may have. So if you email us, we can give you some details on that. Some of it's like we're programming in. So like if we knew the boundaries for all the cultural alliances and arts councils, it might be easier to do it all at once rather than like one at a time, but just definitely you can reach out to us about that.
Hi, this is Lauren from downtown Bridgeport Special Services District, and just transparently up front, I haven't read through all of the reports yet, but I was wondering if you could point to some, we're an economic development, small business focused organization. And I was wondering if there are some insights from the report that might speak to opportunities for entrepreneurship or small business growth that the, equitably done, that the report kind of surfaces.
That's not quite something that we've looked at too much. I don't know, Mark, there was the small business project that I wasn't involved in, actually. That's kind of a area that people ask us about, is local businesses that we haven't done a whole lot of work.
Yeah, there is some other data on that subject. We couldn't include all the indicators we wanted to in this report, just given the length of it. But we sort of selected what we thought would be most useful. And there is some data about wages for different industries, for example, in the reports, and then just like the income data that Camille showed. There's also some information about the built environment, like access to walking routes and things that might be useful for a place like Bridgeport. But as you mentioned, we've done other reports like about entrepreneurship specifically, so there could be other data sources to think about looking at.
Just as a quick follow-up to that, is there, and this is like follow-up offline kind of thing, but is there someone within DataHaven that has done some work in that area or that I could connect with? Because I think the equity lens to that kind of information is so critical and important as we do the work that we're trying to do in terms of local economic development. So I'd love to use this methodology and this approach to looking at, and I think that the lead risk chart was exactly what I am thinking about, that kind of distinction with you when you look at data in two different ways or two different lenses. So I'm just wondering if there's someone else or some other group within DataHaven to follow up with later, more questions toward that end.
Yeah, you can email us and maybe just setting up a phone call would be good.
Thanks.
Oh, and maybe should I call on folks? I guess Laura has her hands or virtual hand raised.
Hey everyone, my name is Laura. I'm from Norwalk, Connecticut, working in the planning and zoning office. I did start to read through the profile for Norwalk and loved it. So thank you so much for compiling all this, and it's really helpful. Something that's kind of been on my mind and kind of conflicting or a bit of a conflict as we prepare our affordable housing plan for the state is the idea that how much demographics have changed since, just between March of 2020 and April of 2020 and that follow-up. And so as I was looking at the census data, I'm wondering how much we should rely on it. And it's tough because it's the only data source we really have. But, as I'm sure a lot of you have experienced, there's a ton of new people in town coming out of New York City. And the real estate market has changed so much. And so I'm just not sure how to tie that into our affordable housing plans and calculations. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that's been a big question, and especially for Fairfield County. I've seen a couple of pieces in the New York Times about the change in population of people moving from New York City into kind of the suburbs of New York City, but then also Fairfield County. And I think that the 2020, so unfortunately the 2020 census is gonna be your best bet. There were issues with it. Part of that being that move happened around the same time as the census was starting. Part of that being issues that there were kind of policy issues around the quality of the census. There are also delays with the data coming out. So we've been kind of checking periodically, and there's one set of data that came out that is at the block level. So it's very, very local, but it is right now it's just by age or by race, and then like households. But not a whole lot more than that is out yet. And the data that should have been, I think, out already, now they're saying by mid-2022. So it's all late, in addition to has some issues. So I think that's going to be your best bet. And a lot of times, where data is on things that already happened. So we're kind of always looking at what were these numbers 2 years ago, 5 years ago. But yeah, I think that's going to be your best bet still.
And Matt had a question earlier too.
Yes, thank you very much. Matt Hart with the town of West Hartford. I'd like to thank Sustainable CT for hosting today's conversation and DataHaven for all your great work to date. I was wondering if you had contemplated any measures that would attempt to assess the state and local tax burden or effective tax rate, especially as a potential barrier to home ownership. You know, it's something we talk a lot about in my circles, you know, the fact that we're so reliant on the property tax here in Connecticut, you know, one of the top 3 nationwide.
Yeah, like there's an indicator in the report, it's called cost burden, that factors in the cost of housing, but also like taxes, utility costs, et cetera. So that gives you a sense of like how much people are paying for housing, whether it's renting or owning, and factoring in, you know, the impact of what the impact of property taxes may be. Sometimes if taxes are high, like mortgages are lower, so it balances out a little bit in that way, but that gives you an overall measure. And then I think what you're also talking about is sort of like property tax equity and differences in property tax that could be due to different factors. And in the community index report we published, like the Greater Hartford Wellbeing Index, there are measures of tax capacity in those that look at like basically how much towns can spend, how much they do spend, how much they could like afford to spend if all other costs were equal. So there's some research on that that's really interesting to show like just wildly different tax base basically and costs of running towns from one town to another. So you can have like Farmington, Connecticut, it could have like $250,000 per person, and then a town like Mansfield, which has UConn, it only has like maybe a tenth of that, and part of that is due to the college students. Then you also have like Hartford, which is maybe 50,000 per person. So you see these vast differences in sort of taxing capacity, and there's some different measures of that in the longer report that we published.
Yeah, and we have looked some at kind of a set of municipal like finance indicators like that. And so we did include some of those, like Mark said, in the community index. One of the issues is just there's not a lot of breakdowns of that sort of data. Like a lot is just going to be at the town level. Some of the stuff we were looking at was kind of out of date when we were getting it as well. So yeah, I would say that data it's kind of tough to get like a good sense of breakdowns within towns or, you know, by different groups or anything.
Okay, thank you. I'll look for the information you cited.
Jennifer?
Hi there. I'm a state representative from Fairfield, and I'm so grateful for this work you're doing. And I think it's so important for everyone to be looking at it. And I was particularly moved by the life expectancy points that you made, that moving a couple streets or across a border is literally life and death. And I think sometimes that can get lost in the discourse. So I really want to thank you for that. And I look forward to digging in a little deeper on it. I was wondering if you have or have any plans to collect any metrics around childcare availability and early childhood education opportunities, because I think that is really critical and something we are going to continue to be looking more and more closely at. And then similarly, food deserts. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on those two metrics.
Yeah, so childcare is another one where the data can be hard to find and to get accurately. But we did a project probably 4 years ago, maybe, with City of Waterbury, looking at like pretty fine-grained, like by zip code, availability of childcare, like the number of slots, kind of estimating the need for subsidized childcare. We did a similar project with locations of childcare providers in Bristol. But I'm trying to think, I can like picture a spreadsheet of childcare slots, and I can't remember which project it was that also went into, but yes, that's something that we've looked at a little bit. The data can be kind of messy to get like a really accurate sense of it, down to the level of like the number of slots in, like the number of subsidized slots and the number of infants and toddlers in lower income households, and all of that sort of detail. So we haven't worked on that recently that I can think of, but that is something that we've looked at, and that is important, but is also can be kind of tricky to measure well.
Yeah, there's obviously a quality factor.
Yeah, it's like regional issue too, because the spots might be like in Bridgeport, but most of the spots might be taken by like commuters from the towns around Bridgeport. So it's a little hard to match up like specific to a town what the need is, what the availability is. But we've worked with the Office of Early Childhood on like, getting those metrics, and there's some information in the community index on that. You also asked about food deserts. So there's national data that maps food deserts that I could share. It's the USDA Alice. It just shows you basically like how close you are to a supermarket and whether you have like access to a car, whether you're like low income. So that information is useful, but it's sort of, we didn't include it in the town equity reports, so it's probably something we could have included because it we think it has some limitations in terms of like what you think of as a food desert's like more than just like whether you have a grocery store that you can drive to. So in our survey though, that we do of adults throughout the state, we also ask if they have access to affordable and like healthy food nearby. And that's probably a better measure, since even places that are like right next to a supermarket, you'll have like very high shares of adults who say they don't have healthy food nearby. And then in another neighborhood that's like pretty far from a supermarket, if it's like a wealthier community, 90 or 100% of adults will say there's like plenty of healthy food in the area. So that survey-based measure might be better. And I think other research has found that also. So we try to triangulate between those different sources.
And you said a lot of that was federal level data. Where could you direct me where to?
Yeah, the survey data is like the survey that DataHaven fields. So that's on the well-being survey section on the website, and the federal data is in the USDA Atlas, and it has a map of Connecticut. It shows, if you go to like Waterbury, Connecticut, they're huge. The food deserts are obvious because there's like not grocery stores in the middle of that section, but we didn't include it in the town equity reports just because of those other limitations.
Thank you so much.
I'm gonna put it in the chat right now because I just looked it up.
Wait,
Thank you for all.
Too. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, I think we're.
No, you're all good, Mark. I was just gonna say, thank you for all those wonderful questions. If you have any others, we will save them till the end. And now I have the pleasure of introducing two of Sustainable CT's wonderful equity coaches, Ashley Stewart and Elizabeth McGee. Take it away, ladies.
Thanks, Chad. So we're in the last 15 minutes, we're going to try to talk about how this DataHaven's reports, equity reports, relates to the Sustainable Connecticut Equity Program. Elizabeth and I have some ideas that we're going to put out there to you all, but also we want to make some space, limited space because of time, for some general comment, and suggest that you all engage with a coach in order to get this going. Edward, I heard you when you said you were just getting started with the toolkit, and I hope you do that along with your coach. So one of the things that I'd like to start with before I pass it to Elizabeth is the reminder that data is alive. That data that isn't growing and alive is not useful data, its history. So the fact that DataHaven is actually seeking out new sources and content and interrogating it, what else should be added is a good sign. And also I forgot who commented about the change in housing. We're going to continue to see changes, but what we want to suggest as equity coaches and with the toolkit is how to use the data as a launching place for the process. Elizabeth?
Hi, everyone. Yeah, I really appreciated all the questions so far. And I know when DataHaven engaged Sustainable CT and the equity coaches had an opportunity to see a similar presentation to what you guys saw today, we were really, really excited about the work that they're doing and saw a lot of potential for it to be used by the towns that we're working with. So yeah, really excited to kind of have this conversation with you all. So we wanted to talk kind of first about just, and you all were already kind of starting to get at that, but just about opportunities that you see in your town that you live in to use the equity profiles that DataHaven's put together. And then we'll probably keep that section a little bit short, and then we'll talk about how they can actually be used specifically to the sustainable CT work, but just generally, what are some opportunities that you see in using the profiles?
We don't want to just talk at you all. Feel free to come off mute.
Hey everyone, as I mentioned, I think we're definitely going to use it for the affordable housing plan that all municipalities are required to submit to the state. So thanks for this.
Hi, this is Pam Roach. I'm working with the town of Rocky Hill on sustainable CT certification. I'm just starting out. As Ed mentioned, she's also with the town of Rocky Hill. Awesome volunteer. Does so much great work. It's been helpful to me. We just met yesterday. But the data, I mean, I'm all about data. I love DataHaven. I love all of your charts and all of your data and all the information. I am sure that there are many different statistics for Rocky Hill that we'll be able to use with several different objectives and actions. So I'm excited to see that information is there. It's recent. So thank you.
Hi, everyone. This is Alyssa Norwood in phone form. I just wanted to thank you all for bearing with my technological journey. And I just wanted to share what I would have said at the beginning had the technology supported it. But I hope what you all walk away with today, and this isn't the end, I want to continue the conversation for the full time until 11, but I'm reminded, well, let me start by telling you a story. Back in 2010, when the Affordable Care Act was first passed, there was a little known dimension of it that asked hospitals to justify their nonprofit status. And in order to justify their 501c3 tax exempt status, hospitals were asked really meaningfully for the first time to do community health needs assessments. And it's from that federal imperative that DataHaven's work, and Mark, you can correct me, really came into being. And the Greater New Haven area had its first deep dive through the Community Wellbeing Survey, which the state is now graced with, and many of those data elements you've heard about are embedded in these reports. And as this work has grown and we have this longevity of incredible, unique Connecticut-specific data, what excites me most is the marriage of objective and subjective. So data alone doesn't get us the answers, as I'm sure Ashley and Elizabeth have told you. Connecting with communities is still vitally important. But this notion that I can look at a community's data and see what crime rates are, but I can simultaneously have data specific to my community that asks people, do you feel safe? That's where things get really powerful and interesting, particularly when stratified by race or ethnicity. how does perception match reality? So I hope that the existence of these reports is a starting point and a catapult to really go deep with the Sustainable CT Equity Toolkit and look at these dichotomies. Sometimes they align and sometimes they don't, but what does the data tell you? And then what do the people in your community tell you, and how do those align or not? So I just wanted to share that thought, and hopefully that's a springboard for further conversation.
Well, thanks, Alyssa, because that is exactly what we wanted to talk about. How does this relate to our program? And like it was mentioned earlier, and also what Alyssa was just alluding to, the equity action starts with looking at data, but it doesn't really end there. It is a great foundation for asking questions and reaching out to your community members. But it's really important that we don't replace data for engagement with your residents. We want to ask the questions. I mean, Camille and Mark mentioned some of the averages lose details that are vitally important for your residents. So whether or not your community has a faith practice, whether or not your community has an ethnic uniqueness will be important, but those are features that we'll only know if we engage with the community. So the equity action within the toolkit, there's a stair-step progression. One of the first steps that stair-step is informing, and we can use this data there. How do we ask questions about who lives in our community, why, what complications are there? But the ending of the stair step is co-creation and collaboration. We can't do that part of equity without people. So the data, this is a wonderful gift for the state of Connecticut, but the data is going to lead us into, hopefully into our communities with purpose. So yeah. We are going to be tight on time, but I'd love to open up for questions or comments about how the equity action and this DataHaven information reports can live together, coexist, work well.
I want to jump back in with just a suggestion for folks as far as use of data. I was interviewed a couple weeks ago about a similar, just about census data, and was asked about like changes in housing. I think it was like new households in a certain area, or like a loss of households, and like, why did that happen? And my answer was that like, we have data on how many people lived there or how many households were there at this point in time, and then at this point in time, and we can, like, I can tell you the percent change, but I don't know that neighborhood. And so I don't know, like, was there a housing development that was closed? Was there, you know, a school shut down and so families moved elsewhere? So my answer was basically that, like, I can give you those like points in time, but not the like neighborhood level story. That, I guess, was not a satisfactory answer because that was cut from the interview. But a lot of times that's where folks can step in, is to actually know the story of that area, that then fills in like what's actually behind the points that, like, we can, you know, we give you those points and then you actually fill in like what is going on and what people need.
That's a great point. Thank you for sharing that.
Ashley, if I may, from Rocky Hill again, we don't have a connection yet to our equity coach, right? Am I correct, Pam? Right. So how would, what would we do to get an equity coach at this point? Because we need one.
So I think I'm emailing Jess right now about that.
Yeah.
Jess is back Monday, right?
I couldn't have put Edward in here on time. That was a perfect question for the wrap up with. But yeah, just like Pam was just saying, you email Jess if you want to engage with an equity coach, and there's 8 of us, and she'll assign you one of 8 equity coaches. We've all been doing this for multiple years, supporting towns and community organizations that are going through this process. Often towns don't know what the first meeting might be like. It is a great time to do this engagement with a coach now before you're under pressure for certification. So the coach will just really chat with your team, or maybe even your team lead, about your town. Looking through this data, what have you learned that was aha? What did you learn that was disheartening? Where are there potential areas for connecting with your residents? And your coach will walk with you through that process. So as you start to engage with your residents differently, finding new approaches to reach out and asking questions. So it's your partner in the process. Your coach will be your partner in the process. Towns can engage with a coach as much or as little as they want. Some towns are off and running and they don't feel like they need as much. Sometimes towns want engagement regularly, and that varies depending on the team. And yeah, honestly, I vouch for all of the coaches. So we're not just cute, we're also really cool, right, Elizabeth? And
can I hop in for a sec?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. So Lynn Stoddard with Sustainable CT. Yes, all of what Ashley said. And you might not know Jess and the inside baseball here. I put it in the chat. Just email info@sustainablecT.org. The coaches are free, supported by Sustainable CT. Lots of towns using them, and they are awesome. So yeah, just the logistics of getting connected, we can get you set up pretty quickly.
One last plug before we, Elizabeth, one last plug I'll make is that we're in the process of doing the equity training sessions. So if you haven't already looked into those, it might be great to engage with those training sessions to build language around how do we talk about these issues that the report is presenting to us at our public meetings, our towns, and things like that. So part of it is just building the vocabulary, the confidence behind what are we talking about here, the complex issues. So feel free to sign up for that. Those are also free and available trainings to you all.
Yeah, and another quick plug. So there's a 2-part training series that I'm leading through Sustainable CT on kind of creative data collection methods. And so that's a really great way to, like Camille, through that story that she was telling about the reporter not listening, that data is not everything, that there is nuances that in the community that are happening that you'll just never be able to get through high level data. And so how do we supplement these reports, these amazing reports, with either additional community engagement efforts or more community specific, context specific data collection. And so I'll talk about kind of creative ways of engaging the community and collecting more of that community and context specific data. So that is next Tuesday and the following Tuesday, and you can find that information on the Sustainable CT website. So another plug for that.
Thank you, DataHaven.
Everyone, I just wanted to, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to wrap it up. Go ahead, Alyssa, you do it.
All right, well, I just know we're right at 11 o'clock, so we want to honor everybody's time. I want to thank all the Sustainable CT staff members, in addition to myself who joined today. A special thanks to DataHaven, to Mark, to Camille. Thank you for your incredible work. Hopefully we've emphasized that this is just the beginning. Elizabeth mentioned that data happens at a moment in time, so too with the creation of these reports, but Sustainable CT embodies this commitment to continuous improvement through partnership and through being grounded in community conversation and feedback. So you are all the on-the-ground users of this information. As you engage with the data, we want to hear from you. What's missing? How can this improve? As more census data is fully released, these reports will be refined and updated. So we're excited to continue to work in collaboration for you to use these reports to promote equity in your communities and in partnership with those around you. So a hearty thank you to everyone, and of course to Sustainable CT's entire team of equity coaches who are doing this work. Again, as Lynn mentioned, email info@sustainableCT.org if you'd like to be partnered. And Ashley and Elizabeth, special thanks to both of you, and go forth and have a beautiful, beautiful day today. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
Great support.